Well, today's guest on the podcast is Dr. Michele Ross, who is a graduate of University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, where she obtained her PhD in neuroscience. Dr. Michele Ross, welcome to the show.
And thank you so much for having me.
And I also noted that you're an author of Vitamin Weeds. It seems like you've done a lot of interesting things in your career. So tell us about, I guess maybe we should start at the beginning. Tell us about how you became a neuroscientist and what led to your interest.
Sure. So ever since I can remember, I was like a 5-year-old, always talking about the brain, always very interested in medicine. My parents, they told me that I actually started reading at like 1.5, which I don't believe because I don't know any 1-year-olds that can read. But basically, my favorite books were medical books. I was reading Mark Manuel. So I was obsessed with medicine. And then once I figured out that you could actually study the brain, I wanted to study the brain. So I was actually like a 7-year-old whose goal was to become a brain scientist and also like a fashion model / actress because, you know, I lived in the Barbie generation. So I was like, I can be a Barbie and a scientist, like hilariously.
Awesome.
But I was very obsessed with knowing how the brain worked, knowing how to help different diseases. Again, I was just really well read on some of these different conditions at a very early age. And it's sort of funny because I didn't really realize that I would end up specializing in drug addiction when I got my PhD in neuroscience. But it really made sense because a lot of my community was really struggling with drug addiction. I actually grew up in front of a house where people were selling crack cocaine and other drugs. So to me, drugs were everywhere. And it seemed like there was some kind of solution. You could be a doctor that could help people that were on drugs, or you could be a scientist that actually discovered the drugs that would be used to treat drug addiction. And at the time, I mean, still right now, there aren't many treatments, really good treatments for addiction. I mean, you see rehab centers where people go to them, 50 times and they're still not in full recovery from their addiction. And so for me, going to school to try to learn how these different mechanisms for drug addiction and substance abuse work and potentially, find a solution for them was really, really personally important for me. And another development actually happened in my life. So when I was doing my postdoc at Caltech, at California Institute of Technology, back in 2009, my little brother actually died from an alcohol and opioid overdose. And so that really, really just refined that passion, that I had for helping people and finding a way to, get people onto safer drugs, whether it's recreational drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, et cetera. And for me, that sort of led me, cannabis was always like interwoven with this whole story. But the fact that cannabis is actually a really amazing tool for helping people transition off of recreational drugs or, wean themselves off, or just they're a different and safer choice that doesn't lead to overdose and death is something that, just worked with me from a science level and a very personal level.
Amazing. So you mentioned a personal level. Tell us about your personal journey.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm very blessed as a scientist to have understood how, different substances influence the brain, how cannabis influenced the brain. But I had a lot of different health issues throughout the years. And, some of them might have even been caused by the work I had in the lab. I was exposed to a lot of chemicals, some of which are very not safe. All I know is that in my late 20s, I started developing some symptoms and I wasn't sure whether I had multiple sclerosis or I had some other kind of disease. I had all these nerve symptoms. So I had a lot of pain, spasms, numbness, and they really did think I had MS for a while. But it turns out I had blood clots, fibromyalgia, neuropathy, a whole bunch of random things. And really, I was on all these different drugs from Lyrica to morphine. I was actually on morphine for 2 years, which is crazy. I mean, here I was a PhD in neuroscience. I had actually studied drug addiction with the top researchers in the world, and I was on morphine for pain. And it was just sort of now that I'm not in that space anymore. It seems sort of crazy, but the doctors didn't know what was wrong with me. So if they can't figure out what's wrong with you and how to treat it, they just prescribe you pain pills, right? Here's one for spasms. Here's one for pain. Here's one for this. Here's an antidepressant because you hate your life now that you're on all these pills and you can't work. So I was on like 10 different pills. I couldn't really work. I actually was so sick at one point. I was in a wheelchair for almost a year. I couldn't really, take care of myself. I required my partner to basically feed me, clothe me, like do everything for me. And it turns out that it was once I decided to get off these medications and onto cannabis oil, and I actually used a form of cannabis called Rick Simpson oil, which is a very concentrated form of THC. And I took that consistently for about 3 to 4 months, that I really saw, rapid improvement in my symptoms. So I was able to start graduating from a wheelchair to a walker. I was starting to be more cognizant and present. I wasn't even able to focus on watching say Netflix. I was so bad. I was just not there on all these different medications. I was able to get off my medications, get off morphine, which, by the way, going through morphine withdrawal is one of the most unpleasant experiences. Let's just say that, and difficult experiences I think anyone would ever have to experience. For me, it was very challenging because I was also in a lot of pain. As a chronic pain patient, you're not just going on it because, you're looking for the recreational benefits of opioids. You really are on it because you're a patient who needs pain management. So for me, getting off all these medications, I couldn't have done all that without cannabis. And to this day, I use a whole different regimen of drugs from, ingestibles. I'll take edibles. I use tinctures. I vape. I use salves. I use suppositories. I use basically any cannabis product that's been out there I've used, and they all have different purposes for me. But for me, my body needs cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot live without it. I'm spasming, I'm sick, I'm depressed, I have rashes, I can't walk, I'm a mess. You take away my cannabis for a month, I will be bedridden. So for me, it doesn't even really need a label. It's just funny that there is actually this term called endocannabinoid deficiency. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wrote this book called Vitamin Weed. It was a 4-step plan to prevent or reverse endocannabinoid deficiency. There are actual conditions tied to really, really low levels of endocannabinoids in the system or cannabinoid receptor function. And for me, I have fibromyalgia, and fibromyalgia is considered a disease of endocannabinoid deficiency. So me and so many of the other patients that I've helped and I've talked to throughout the world, they all benefit from cannabis in whatever shape or form. So you give fibromyalgia patients cannabis, they do better. And they do better than they do on these other drugs. So there seems to be a key point where, we don't know whether it's a cannabinoid receptor that's messed up in fibromyalgia, whether, we don't make enough of these endocannabinoids, but there's something to it. And there's something to endocannabinoid deficiency, I think, playing a role in a lot of diseases. And I think we're going to find out. The researcher has to catch up with this. There wasn't a lot of federal money thrown at cannabis research for years because it was an illegal drug. You can't really study, hey, let's see how heroin is helping people or, MDMA, it was in the same category. So right now we're just figuring out that, oh goodness, we should have been studying and looking for the cannabinoid system as a drug target to treat all these different conditions. But, we're just at the tip right now. And I've been so excited to work in this industry. The brain was exciting when I first started. Mm-hmm. We didn't have all these tools. We have all these tools now we didn't have 50 years ago in terms of MRIs and brain imaging and all these different tools to manipulate the brain to understand how these diseases work. So neuroscience was an exciting field for me to study. And that's why I did my PhD in it. But it's funny because cannabinoid medicine is sort of the next frontier. We have so many tools to use there. We have so many applications for it medically. So I don't think it's very surprising that you actually see a lot of neuroscientists in cannabinoid medicine. A lot of neuroscientists have transitioned out because we understand how the brain works. We understand how these receptors work. So there's no stigma attached to it. We're we know what the endocannabinoid system is. We were trained on it in school. A lot of different fields weren't, but neuroscientists knew about the endocannabinoid system. So you don't have to convince us. We know that cannabis works. We're excited about it. And for some of us who are really brave, we decided to commit our entire career to it.
That's amazing. Now, I have, I guess, a devil's advocate question. It seems like cannabis works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for everyone. Could that be
Mm-hmm.
related to the functions of the ECS system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a big disconnect between, I think, using cannabis and using it for, to treat your condition. And so some people think that there's, a magic strain for a condition, right? Okay,
Mhm.
there's going to be this special combination of terpenes and combination of different cannabinoids, and that's going to be the treatment for this disease. And there's another combo for this disease, et cetera. And that's not really how it works. Cannabis is very much personalized medicine.
Mhm.
We all have different brain chemistries. We all have different genetics with different SNPs, right? Like some of us have overactive cannabinoid receptors. Some of us have dysfunctional cannabinoid receptors. Like we see in Crohn's disease, we have dysfunctional cannabinoid receptors. I don't think that there's going to be a magic bullet for each disease. I think that even say, for example, with fibromyalgia, and I say this because I'll put a room of 40 fibromyalgia patients together, giving a talk to them. And the ones that use cannabis, all of them use different strains. So it's not really about your disease. I think the main key point is that THC itself is very healing in terms of reducing inflammation, spasms, pain, right? And so that part of it works, but there's different terpenes and different profiles that might not match with certain people. Some people are more anxious with certain types of terpenes, right?
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter how healing that blend might be for your body. If you say smoke a joint and you feel like you're having a panic attack, you're not going to use that medicine. And
Right.
so it turns out that it's really this combination between these profiles and sort of like your personality, like who you are and who your DNA is. And I don't think that there's a magic fit between strains, between dosing. There's some people that, for the same condition require a much higher dose. We all have different, levels of liver health. We all have different combinations or different ways that we metabolize drugs. Some of us are fast metabolizers of, say, CBD, for example. Like some people will take a CBD gummy and say, didn't do anything for me,
Right.
and they really need THC. There's other people that swear, they're like, I took one drop of a CBD oil and I'm cured.
Amazing,
It's so
right?
weird, this range, right, of how these products impact people. And so part of my work over the years, actually founded a research institute called the Impact Network in Denver, Colorado, and just looking at, what are people's different responses to products and what's influencing that. And there's still so much that we don't understand. And part of that was because the products were so inconsistent over the years, right? A
Mhm.
lot of these products were not federally legal. Of course, THC is still not federally legal. CBD just sort of became legal across the United States. This is very new. So, we weren't allowed to do a lot of research for it. And I would say that the products on the market, right? You would buy something that you would think had 150 milligrams of, say, CBD in it, and you would put it through testing and be like, actually, there's half as much in there. Like, so if you don't know the dosage that is actually in your product, it's really hard to do any clinical research on that, right? You don't know whether a
Right.
person's getting 150 or 45 milligrams. Like, you don't know. So you can't really understand or extrapolate the data that's coming out of there. Like some people are doing studies via apps, right? Somebody self-reports, okay, well, I smoked this joint. I think that there's this much, how many milligrams of THC in it or something. Like people are just all eyeballing and ballparking things. And things were very inaccurate. People misreported, the apps misreported. Like there was just a lot of junk data going in and a lot of junk data going out. So it was hard for us. It's that doing one-on-one where we know exactly what people were getting, like we're giving them the products and watching the responses or, getting surveys directly from them. There was a lot of confusion, I think, over what people were actually using. And so that's why the gold standard in the research community is really those double blind, controlled studies where we know exactly what people are getting, but there just hasn't been funding for that. So we've been trying to make do with what we have out there.
Mhm.
But, right now, a lot of doctors don't think this is medicine because they're so confused. They're like, okay, I have a patient with fibromyalgia. What dose should they be on? What products should they take? And you're like, well, we need to have them sit down and review their genetics and review their lifestyle, review their liver enzymes. And they're like, this is way too more complicated
Right.
than, what they're used to. But for any person that thinks that this is not medicine or this is too confusing, that there needs to be a dose and a tablet for each of these diseases, right? There needs to be a magic tablet. We need to look at, the psychiatric world. And I actually was trained in a department of molecular psychiatry. So this is why, all this made sense to me. If you look at a patient with depression, when they go to their psychiatrist, the psychiatrist cannot look at them and know what dose or what brand of antidepressant they need to be on. It's literally trial and error. And in the same way, when you start off with cannabis, there is a little bit of trial and error. We're going to, work with different doses, different products, different route of administration. And sometimes how you know what will work for a person is by what didn't work. For example, some strains have very rare cannabinoids in them. And if somebody has a weird response to that, we know never again give you a cannabis product with that specific terpene profile. And there are some that are anxiety provoking. There are some that, make people sleepy and they want to be up during the day. There are some things that we know very well about the science of, say, terpene profiles or cannabinoid profiles, but there's still some that we don't exactly know. And it's probably because the lab testing isn't that accurate about how much of these terpene profiles are actually in the products.
Interesting. Which strains cause more anxiety? Because I've definitely heard that from a lot of people.
Yeah. So, for example, THC can provoke anxiety in some patients. Also, there's some terpene profiles like terpenoline that can provoke anxiety. Again, it's interesting because you have a thing where the majority of people that show anxiety will say that they use strains that contain these. Of course, it's just like any other thing where you'll find people that are like, that has never provoked anxiety with me, and a terpene profile that doesn't provoke anxiety and most people provokes anxiety in them. It's very interesting. But for me personally, I can't use products with THCV. I know as soon as I touch one, and this is why I tell people, whether they're using cannabis medically or recreationally, to really be careful about the products you're using. I know cannabis is a very social thing. And sometimes people are always like, well, I passed around a vape pen or a joint or things like that. But, if you've ever had a bad experience with cannabis, it might not be just cannabis, and I put that in quotes. It might just be that there was a specific minor cannabinoid or terpene in there that just doesn't go with your brain chemistry. And very similar to just some people where they say, okay, I can drink alcohol. I'm fine. I'm a social drinker. But, how some people are like, don't give me tequila or don't give me some weird brand. They're like, that just either gives me a hangover or makes me sick or, whatever it is. Like, don't give me red wine. It gives me a headache. Right. So for some people, there are some strain profiles that they need to avoid. And for this, I always suggest people take a diary, take a journal, really explore that cannabis journey. Where were you when you consumed cannabis? How much did you take? What kind of strain did you use? There's apps for this too that are journaling, like Strain Print. There's a whole bunch out there. If you look on the Apple Store, if they haven't banned them, I know that they're going and trying to take all the cannabis apps off every other day. But
interesting.
Yeah. But it's really important that consumers really do understand what they're using and what their intention was about it and what the effect was. Because if you're anxious, already and you take something, it might provoke your anxiety. But if you're in a safe place and you take the same product, you might actually feel safer. It's all about setting and dosage, and what your intention is. If you want to feel in the mood, do you want to, or do you want to, be up for work and focused? Do you want to be creative? These substances can all influence you in different ways depending on how are you using them. So it's because they're adaptogens. It's so complex. There's no medical product out there that you take and you're like, gives you one effect in this room, gives you one effect in this day, But cannabis is very much something that just amplifies you. So, if you use it with intention, you use it with breath work, you use it in yoga to relax, it's going to make you more relaxed.
Right.
If you're in a situation where you're more stressed out, you might actually find it's not helping with anxiety. It's making you very aware that you are anxious. Or there's some people with back pain that specific strains will not help them with the back pain. In fact, it just makes them focus. They're like, oh my God, I've got glowing like hot coal in my back. Like that's all I can think about is how much this back pain hurts, where, that's not exactly the experience that they wanted. They wanted to forget that they had back pain, not focus on it more. That can be a very uncomfortable time. And so that's a specific example of when cannabis consumption actually increases pain instead of decreases it. We don't talk about that a lot as clinicians or in the industry. Like there are times where cannabis can make you feel more pain, and that's because it is just helping you focus. But unfortunately, your brain is focusing on the pain, not on other things. So, it's very important that I think patients and even consumers really work with someone to understand how to find the right products that give them the effects that they want.
Interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. I think perhaps maybe talking a little bit about fibromyalgia and talking about your patient journey. Some of our listeners are going to be very familiar with it. Some won't be. So I think it'd be interesting to talk about really how long it takes to get that diagnosis and what does that diagnosis mean actually.
Sure. So for me, it was actually very easy to get the diagnosis just because I was aware of some of the symptoms. And I would say easy. It wasn't obviously easy because it was easy once I started regaining some of my function. It was funny because I didn't actually get diagnosed with it until I had started using the cannabis. Obviously, when I was like too sick to like even be able to like wake up, and I was like in an oxygen tank and like in a wheelchair, like I couldn't like tell anyone like how sick I was and like what my specific symptoms were because I was in so much pain and like not okay. But once I was able to verbalize exactly what was wrong with me, where it hurt and like how it hurt, and also it was just funny because it's like the doctor and me had like the light bulb moment at the same time, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is fibromyalgia." Just going through it, but you have to talk with doctors that understand what that disease is. And not a lot of doctors. I feel like some doctors don't feel like fibromyalgia is a real disease because for the longest time there was like no real mechanism for it. So fibromyalgia is this chronic pain disease, and it manifests in different ways in different people. Some people feel like electrical shocks. Some people feel burning. Some people feel their limbs are heavy. Some have pain when people touch them. Like there's nausea, vomiting, headaches. Like it's just like you feel bad all over and in different places and different times. Like it's a miserable disease. You're very tired too. Fatigue is a huge, huge component of it. How they test for fibromyalgia. So there's several pain points on the body, and basically a doctor can touch you. And if all of a sudden, like there's literally like they'll like tap this very specific part of your body and you're like wincing in pain and you're like, wow, a normal person wouldn't hurt if you just like lightly tap them in this place. And these are like these pain points and these trigger points throughout our body. And so that's how it's diagnosed. So it's sort of funny for me, for a while, I was having like these really weird pains, like really weird places like in my body. And I'm like, did I bruise myself? Like, what is going on? Like, why does it hurt so bad in these places? I don't see anything. And so when it made sense that I didn't even know actually that the test for fibromyalgia was this touch test. And so when they were pressing on me and I was like, oh my goodness, this makes sense. I think that there are some blood tests for it now. I haven't been tested for that. I think that there's some false positives with the test. But for me, it wasn't so much about I need a name for what is wrong with me. I just wanted to one, make sure like I wasn't dying of something terminal or something. Because I know like with MS, right, it's a neurodegenerative disease. So the earlier you catch it and you start using treatments for it, the better your prognosis is. So I was afraid that I had something that was going to get progressively worse. Right. Fibromyalgia, thank God, there's no progression. It really is all about just making sure, of course you could be in more pain if you are eating things that cause more inflammation or you're not taking care of yourself, you're not taking proper rest and things like that. But it doesn't get worse with age or with, function or things like that. So it's a little bit different than MS. So basically I feel as bad as I ever will, but I feel pretty bad. Like I feel like 80-year-old version of Michelle, like today. Right. So it's definitely a terrible disease. And for me, there's still parts of my life where I really, you have this mourning process for a while when you realize that you have a horrible disease where you go like, well, I'll never be able to run a marathon ever again. I think that's probably not going to happen. You're like, you also have to be very careful where you exhaust your energy really fast. And there's a thing with chronic illness called spoon theory. Like you have like a certain number of spoons during the day. Like you have like, say, 5 energy spoons, right? And it's like you deplete them and you can choose what you do during the day. Like if you want to go work out for 2 hours, you will deplete all of your spoons. You can't do anything else. Like you can't do laundry, you can't work or anything like that. So you have to be very strategic about how your time is spent. And for me, because I work really hard, that means that, where did the extra energy, where did I cut out of my life? For me, it was my social life. So for me, I don't get out of the house as much as I used to. For me, being a speaker, I have to be very strategic when I go to conferences or I go to networking events to really take care of myself, whether that's taking extra breaks during the day, extra sleep, extra massages, all those things. I always have to make sure that my health and self-care is at like the top priority. And sometimes, that means, missing out on opportunities that I just know will be too exhausting and it sucks. So you're like, even if you're like at the top of your game, and I do health coaching, right? I help people but you have to realize that there's only a certain level you can get to before your body breaks down. And I think a great example of this for my disease is Lady Gaga. So Lady Gaga was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And of course, you see her on stage, she's giving it her all, and then she collapses, and she has the best doctors, the best, nutrition chefs, all those kind of things. And she still pushes herself to the limit, but there's only so much you can do before you end up exhausted in the hospital. And so there's no benefit to that, right? So for me and many of my patients, I say, no, you might never be able to perform at the level that you did before you were diagnosed with this, but due to the side effects of a lot of these different drugs, they're really horrible. Sometimes the drugs are worse than the disease, to be honest. I took the drug called Lyrica, which only works for about 5% of patients. It didn't work for me, didn't help me with my pain or my spasms, made me gain 50 pounds in 2 months, made me like out of it. I was slurring my words and I was like, this is not good at all. Like that was literally the stimulus for me going, okay, this is one more drug that they put me on. And this is like, I don't know what else to do after this. Like nothing is helping. And here I am slurring and I've gained 50 pounds. Like this is the worst. And that's when I decided really to get off all the drugs and onto cannabis. I just had enough. I was like, this is the best medicine it can offer me. This is horrible. Right. But there are so many patients out there where they don't want to get up in the morning because they're in pain. They're taking all these drugs that, have horrible side effects. They don't have a sex drive. They have migraines. They have nausea. Like literally they're taking a drug for nausea that causes nausea. Like it's just like the daily life of someone with chronic illness in the United States is horrible. Right. I mean, you see actually a high suicide rate in patients with chronic illness because living with these kind of illnesses, if you weren't depressed before, living with it will give you depression, right. And a lot of people don't have those support networks too. So, if you're a sick person, you might not be able to work as much, or you might not be able to take care of your kids. So your money goes towards childcare or something else like that. Like most people with chronic illness now have spent all their money on healthcare and, they're sort of broke, Yeah. And so it's very hard place where the United States doesn't take care of people with chronic illness. And, we struggle. And it's hard because a lot of patients will come to me and they're very interested in cannabis. The problem, though, is that cannabis is not covered by health insurance. Right. And the doctor visits are not covered by health insurance. Even I get consultations besides the online programs I do. And I charge $150 for visits and follow-up care. But again, it's not covered by health insurance. So if you're already a struggling chronically ill patient, you're going, well, I'm on Medicaid. So I have only this amount of money to spend. So I have to choose between, going and seeing a doctor or paying for cannabis. And the cannabis is out of pocket too. We're talking like most chronically ill patients are used to paying like $10 copays, right. for their medicines. And so I've had some patients go, well, thank you very much. I'm so glad to hear about these options. I definitely want to get off opioids, but it's free for me to pick up my morphine, and it will cost me $120 a month, for a small amount of cannabis in the legal dispensary model. They go, I can't afford that, and unfortunately they're right. And that's why, I wish that there was more states that permitted growing of cannabis and things like that. In California, of course, we live in a state where it's legal too, but it's hard for a lot of patients to grow.
Especially if you're ill and you're in pain. Yes. To garden is not the easiest thing.
Yeah, I don't do that myself, and of course I don't live in an apartment building either that would allow me to grow cannabis, but it's the price is, I think, the most unfortunate part about this, because we know that this medicine can help so many people, but it comes down to the economics of it. If you can't afford it, if the choice for opioids is easier for you to do than cannabis, you're going to choose that every day. So, I mean, it's such a battle to help us help patients because they just can't afford it. And especially in California, I mean, we see huge problems here with homelessness, with a broken healthcare system. No one has any extra money. I mean, 40% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
And so these are the same Americans that we're hoping will pay, $20 for a pre-roll in a dispensary. And as much as I support the legal system, right now, it's so hard for people to adopt this. I mean, the medical market, I think, is struggling in California just because, again, the prices, there's taxes on medical marijuana in California, and that doesn't make any sense to me.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for addressing that, because I think so often chronic pain patients are the misunderstood group, right? I really believe that by and large, they're getting undertreated for their pain because, I mean, a certain level of opiate is necessary to treat certain conditions. And if you're in pain all the time and it's not cutting it, you're labeled a drug seeker. But in reality, you're still actually in a lot of pain. And it's not humane for anyone to experience that level of pain. So I feel that it's the group that really often gets misunderstood, and I don't think there's enough of an answer in the medical establishment for them. And that's why I think it's great that there are practitioners like yourself that are looking at alternatives that can provide an answer, at least, right? If you can get your disease under control, then you can get your life under control, then you can go to work, then all the other problems will be solved.
Well, speaking on these other options, right? So cannabis is just one of the tools in the toolbox that I use. Because again, there is an affordability issue with that. There's also legal issues, right? THC, medical marijuana, recreational marijuana is still not legal across 100% of the United States. There's still some states where, CBD will get you into trouble, which sounds crazy, but it's true. There's about 3 states where it's really not legal to ship to those states. So for those patients or patients for some reason that are getting drug tested for THC at work, there's still a lot of government jobs where you can't have any cannabis unless it's a Marinol prescription, even if it's legal in your state. This is where the conversation comes in to Kratom or Kratom. Everyone says it a little bit differently, but I'm from Jersey, so I'll say Kratom. But this is actually another green plant that is made into a powder that people can either use in drinks or they can make capsules in. And there's different strains of it, just like there are in cannabis. And how Kratom works, it actually works on your opioid system.
Really?
But unlike opioids like morphine or heroin, it's almost impossible to overdose on the substance because when it activates the opioid receptors, it doesn't activate the downstream components that lead to respiratory depression and death. So this is why it's an amazing alternative for people who are in recovery from opioid addiction. In fact, a lot of former heroin users have transitioned to Kratom, and they find that it helps them, with withdrawal cravings, and they are able to stay sober from heroin because it is activating the opioid receptors in some way, almost similar to, like how Suboxone or these other opioid replacement therapies work. But it doesn't have these negative side effects that the traditional pharmaceutical opioids have, right? You're not having, horrendous GI problems, weight loss, a whole bunch of things that are associated with opioid use. And it's a very, very natural substance. For pain patients in particular, there's some forms of pain that are really hard to treat with cannabis sometimes. And, there's some forms of pain that you need really high dosing with cannabis. And some patients get sleepy, right? Okay, well, I need 50 milligrams to manage my horrific back pain, but as soon as I take it, I'll fall asleep. Like, what do you do if you need to go to work during the day? You can't be sleepy or you can't feel high at work. So how do you manage these really high-level pains or difficult forms of pain? Like I told you, some patients, when they smoke cannabis, they feel like their back pain is worse, it's flared up. So what do you do for those patients that cannabis just doesn't work right? And, no matter what they do, it's just not working. And for some patients, we actually have them on a combination of CBD and Kratom. And so CBD will help reduce inflammation, will help reduce pain, but it's not enough by itself. Kratom, of course, there's a dosing there with opioids. With any opioids, you can either feel stimulant, like it can act as a stimulant at a lower dose, or act as a depressant at a higher dose. So it can help you go to sleep if you take a lot of it, and also help you stay awake and fight fatigue if you take a little bit. So it's got a very U-shaped curve. It's very interesting. Yeah. So it's very much like cannabis, right? People microdose and they're like, oh, I'm awake, I'm focused. And then they take a lot and they the big pot brownie and they fall asleep, So it's got a similar profile in that way. But it is a green powder that you can literally get a kilogram of it for, maybe $120 for lab tested, good quality product that's completely clean for $120. We're talking kilo. We're not talking grams.
Right.
Now, how long would that last you per day? Well, the average dose, people are taking, a gram, 2 grams per day. So this would last you like a year or two, right?
Wow.
So we're talking like $120 for a year or 2 year supply of pain medication.
Right.
So when we're talking to patients that say, I can't afford this, I will choose my morphine, I say, wait. Let's have another conversation here. So it's cheaper than CBD, it's cheaper than cannabis, and it's effective for most patients.
And it's legal.
With a caveat. So for a while, because there was a component in there, the chemical component is called mitragine. So they're trying to develop a pharmaceutical out of it. And the DEA actually wanted to reschedule Kratom as a Schedule I drug, not because it was dangerous, not because anyone was dying from it, because again, you can't die from it. I think you would literally probably have, similar to cannabis, where you had to smoke an entire kilo of cannabis to maybe have something go wrong. I think it was the same way. You'd have to eat so much Kratom, it would be absurd. You couldn't even do it physically to die from it. So with Kratom, it was really the same deal that we saw with cannabis, where they wanted to develop THC into a pharmaceutical, so it had to stay Schedule I. Well, because Kratom was a supplement that was sold, on Amazon and in different shops and things like that. Now it's sort of regulated the head shops where CBD is at, but for the longest time it was available everywhere. And so, in order to make it into a pharmaceutical drug, they have to protect their patents and things like that. So they wanted to make it a Schedule I drug, and the pain patient population and, people in recovery from opioid addiction really got together with these different associations and fought back. Literally, think about this in the cannabis world. You've never seen this, where people would go to the DEA offices and protest that say cannabis is still a Schedule I drug. We would never do that. Cannabis patients will never do that. Kratom patients were.
Right.
They actually found, veterans and people with PTSD and all these different people were saying and wrote letters and things like that. And they were like, I will kill myself because Kratom is the only thing I can afford and the only thing that works for me.
Right.
I will literally die without this. And the reason why people were saying that it would die is because it's not possible. I don't think you can grow Kratom in the United States. It's a very fickle plant. I think they get it from Indonesia and other tropical places. And so they have to import it. So technically, if the United States decided to catch all the imports, there would be no more Kratom coming in.
Right.
So it'd be difficult. There's still a possibility of them trying to make it a scheduled drug in the future. But so far, because so many people protested, they made, the panel where the DEA has to consider rescheduling or scheduling the drug in the future, 1 or 2 years from now. So right now it's still safe for people to take. There are some cities, for example, this is really weird because I was in Denver when this happened. Denver decided overnight one day to just outlaw it. And we're like, why? Why is it outlawed? There's 2 or 3 cities in the United States where it's not legal to get shipments into. And I lived there. As soon as they said it's illegal to get your medicine, I said, oh God, not again. This sounds like Cannabis 2.0. And I said, I'll just move to another city, because this is my medicine and this is how I'm treating patients. And, it's legal in California, it's legal in LA. I think there's even manufacturing, GMP level manufacturing facilities located in San Diego. So there are people that are doing it right. There are people that are doing it wrong, just like there are every nutraceutical. You can look at any vitamin. There's some company there that's doing it wrong and has flour powder in it or is putting things in there that shouldn't be in there. But there are amazing Kratom manufacturers in the United States, and it is actually something that I really wish. It's so funny because I'm a patient and I'm a clinician, so it's sort of weird because sometimes I'm caught in the middle between the industry, their needs and patient needs. But I think that the reason why the kratom conversation doesn't come up very much in the cannabis world is because it's so much cheaper and it's,
Right.
almost a competitor, right? If you're saying, okay, well, take these oils, take some of these things, and somebody could use something that's even cheaper and effective, like why would they use cannabis if that worked for them, right? And there's
Right.
still so much stigma about cannabis and things like that. For me, I still use cannabis every day. I use kratom every day. I
Oh,
use
interesting.
some form of medicinal mushrooms every day. So like I use multiple things because fibromyalgia is a very complex disease with a lot of different symptoms. And I have different levels of activity, or I have different states that I go to. Sometimes I go to states where cannabis isn't legal, and I need to take a lot of kratom with me because I know I need to have all my pain management done by that. But for me, it's nice to have a backup so that I know that I don't have to risk going to jail when I go visit countries or states where THC is illegal. It's not worth it for me. I've seen other other cannabis advocates and educators get in trouble with the law for taking their medicine across state lines or in other states. And to me, that's not worth the risk. And it's not also an example I want to show for other patients.
Right.
I want to say respect state laws right now. The most dangerous thing for cannabis is to be caught with it, right? Like no one needs to go through the legal system. I've been through it. I fought my own case. I was cleared like a year later, but it was very, very hard.
Wow.
So it's very, very important. Follow the laws in your state. If THC is not legal, you have two options, really. Move to a state where it's legal, or, explore these other products like kratom, like CBD, and medicinal mushrooms or psychoactive mushrooms. There's a lot of different tools in the toolbox. It's an exciting time now.
Amazing. It's interesting you mentioned Denver and it illegalizing kratom, but they have medicinal mushrooms as a legal option, correct?
Yeah, and so I just want to clarify. So there's actually two terms out there. So medicinal mushrooms actually refers to mushrooms that are used in like Chinese medicine, right? So we're talking like cordyceps or chaga or reishi mushrooms, and these are mushrooms that have some medical benefits. And then there's psychoactive mushrooms, which we sort of don't put under the medicinal mushroom umbrella, although they are very medicinal. And the psychoactive mushrooms are ones that contain psilocybin, which is a psychoactive substance that causes people to trip when consumed in large quantities, or, has some positive effects on mental health, from reducing addictions to boosting mood to, enhancing creativity and so many things. And I was actually part of the team that helped legalize, or not legalize, because I have to be very careful here with the language, decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms in Denver. And it was interesting. So of all the places in the United States, there are certain cities that are more open and liberal towards drugs. And of course, it's so funny because I really don't see these as drugs. I see these as plants that people take. I hate the term drugs, but there's certain places, right? You're not going to start a decriminalization movement in, say, Kansas, for example. Colorado is very open to freedom, to, the freedom to choose what goes in your body. And in fact, they were the first state that legalized, sorry, I just got a weird message. We were the first state that legalized recreational marijuana.
Right.
And so for us, that really showed that they were a little bit more forward thinking. And Denver is a very, very forward thinking city. So we went there. We won by like 51% of the city voted for it. And so, we were able to pass it there, and it started springing up across the country. But in terms of why decriminalization is so important, it comes down to that thing where, people are less likely to use something that might even have medical benefit for them if it has that criminalization approach, right?
Sure.
If I use this, or I have this at my house, will I go to jail forever? And right now, magic mushrooms are actually still a Schedule I drug. So again, same level as heroin. So it's a problem. We hope that one day it also gets descheduled. But right now there's been city by city and state by state approaches to decriminalize it. But the thing is, it's sort of interesting. It's not like cannabis, right? It doesn't smell. And, it's not like when you have a cultivation center for cannabis and you can smell it from a mile away. If somebody is growing a small amount of mushrooms, they actually grow outside naturally in some states. Like in Oregon, for example, like people could just pick them outside, even though that's supposedly illegal. They just grow naturally. I mean, they've been part of the United States. So it's possible for them to grow outdoors. It's possible for people to grow them inside themselves very easily and very inexpensively. So imagine if magic mushrooms have been clinically shown to help reduce depression or reduce anxiety about, being diagnosed with a terminal illness like cancer. Imagine if instead of being prescribed all these medications you can't afford, you were able to take small doses of mushrooms to help with your PTSD, to help with your depression, to help with your anxiety. Imagine you were able to grow a year's worth for, maybe under $200. That's that same price point I'm talking about with Kratom. So here we have these natural plant substances that have tremendous value for mental health or for other illnesses. And there's even some autoimmune disorders that mushrooms are being suggested that are useful for. Like there's other purposes for it besides mental health and addiction, even though that's the main thing that's being published right now. But it's very fascinating to me to think that there are these other tools that are inexpensive that, although they might be quasi-legal or completely illegal in some, places, it's just interesting because most of us probably know somebody that could access this. And so it's awkward as me for the clinician to have conversations about illegal drugs with patients. But it's just funny because in the back of my mind, I'm like, I'm still talking about cannabis, which is a federally illegal drug. So it's the same conversation,
Absolutely.
It's sort of a bizarre world. Like I never thought I'd be like the black market scientist,
right? Yeah.
But here I am just because of ridiculous drug laws. And we're seeing, countries like Canada completely legalize cannabis and thinking about psychedelics. We're seeing Mexico consider decriminalization of all drugs. Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. They have a harm reduction first approach in that country. So, I think that these drug laws will be changing over time, but it's still sort of weird for me to have these conversations. And patients are like, should I tell my psychiatrist that I want to use illegal drugs to treat my problems? And you're like, oh gosh, I have a lot of education to do. I'm not well loved in the psychiatric community, right? Because they've been trained on all these different synthetic drugs and they haven't been trained on plant medicine. So it's funny. There's still, I think, a very much, there's some adversity between old school doctors and this new school. I think that the younger generation is definitely more plant loving in so many different ways. We're all like vegans and saying, let's do mushrooms instead of Prozac and things like that. We become the new hippie generation. But the thing is that the plant-based life is working. And so I really think that it's important that we focus on, cannabis, kratom, and mushrooms. I think it's important that we focus on mindset, meditation, yoga, really, controlling our own pain, controlling our own fears, controlling our own breath, controlling our own health. And we focus on nutrition, that we, try to veer towards a mostly plant-based diet to control a lot of illnesses, whether it's depression, whether it's fibromyalgia, whether it's epilepsy. All these things can be managed or improved by proper diet. And so I really sort of lump all this together as plant-assisted therapy, or PAT. And I launched a website called the Institute of Plant-Assisted Therapy because I really do think that this is the future of plant medicine and the future of care. I think that we really are going to get away from the synthetics because, there is a plant for all of us out there.
I think that's amazing. And I'm so glad that you're bringing attention to this field, this industry. And again, I really strongly believe that the chronic pain patient often gets overlooked. So it takes activists and other patients to come together and bring attention to these things, because otherwise, I think, as you mentioned, I think the active ingredient often gets isolated, gets scheduled, and it gets sold separately as a pill. And it's important for people to realize there are alternatives and be able to use alternatives with awareness and with some education.
The psychoactivity, there are people that are trying to take the magic out of magic mushrooms. There are people that want to take, the psychoactivity from THC. And there is some healing actually in psychoactivity, right? The most important thing to remember in a lot of chronic illnesses is that not necessarily that trauma causes chronic illness, but it can worsen it. And I think that we store, whether it's from an abusive relationship or a trauma from our childhood, we store that pain in our body, whether it's our backs or hips or neck or head. We all have backaches and headaches and so many things. Women have pelvic pain has no, medical cause. We don't know why it's there, right? And I think that it's important for us to address, trauma. And for some people, being able to sort of get outside their head, feel high or feel elevated or feel different or feel calmed down. That feeling of being high, whether it's on mushrooms, cannabis, et cetera, is important for some people to actually rewire their brain and see trauma from a different point of view, or see how far that they've grown, and sort of actually help them forget some of these very traumatic memories. Cannabis in particular actually works to help your brain forget memories. You have these receptors in your hippocampus, and this is some of the graduate work I did. You have these receptors in this hippocampus, this learning memory area. And when they're activated, they literally let go of these horrible memories. And so, holding on to harmful memories or repeating these memories over and over again is one of the key parts of why people stay depressed or why PTSD is so persistent. And so forgetting is so important. So really, when you fuel your endocannabinoid system, whether it's through CBD or cannabis, you are actually helping your brain let go of the pain. And that translates in letting go of physical pain. So I think it's so important that, if you're scared of the psychoactivity, if you're scared about being high, just remember it's about setting and intention. And there are actually practitioners now in Colorado, California, Oregon, all over the United States where people are getting together in circles and they're doing the breath work. They're using the cannabis to enhance that feeling of letting go, of releasing tension or releasing the pain, releasing all that baggage. And that can be really powerful, that sharing experience where everyone is healing together. I've been actually part of some of those healing experiences, and there's amazing practitioners. I've also been part of a group called This Is Jane Project, where we get women together and they all smoke and share their stories of trauma or things that they've, survived and how they're doing now, and, meeting and, growing and learning and creating that sisterhood all over cannabis. So, some people are so scared of it. Don't be scared of it, and if you've had bad experiences, talk to somebody about it. Say, what can I do differently to not panic while I use cannabis? Sometimes the panic is actually because it's bringing up those memories or those things that you wanted to suppress from long ago. Cannabis is really holds a light up to yourself, and it helps you be honest with yourself, and it helps you sort of guide you into where you need to go in the future. If there's something that cannabis makes you feel unsettled about, it might be the things that you didn't want to work with from your past that it's time to grow through.
Amazing. You mentioned This Is Jane project. I'm curious, is there any published studies that you're aware of in use of cannabis in women that are pregnant or breastfeeding? And what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So there is actually a lot of research on cannabis in women, and it's interesting because some of it was very negative. So in the past, there was research suggesting, okay, if you're a woman and you use cannabis, your child might have, brain issues, or lower IQ or lower birth weight. And they went back and looked at some of these older studies. And what they found out was that the women weren't just using cannabis, they were also smoking cigarettes and drinking and using other hard drugs. So it was really hard to parse out whether it was the cannabis or whether it was these other drugs. And so more recent studies have looked at women who are just consuming cannabis. And again, because these are very new studies, people aren't looking at whether people are using tinctures or whether they're smoking, or they're smoking legal cannabis, or they're smoking, Mexican brickweed that's not tested and God knows what's in it, But there has been some research out there that suggests that consuming cannabis during pregnancy is associated with low birth weight. Right now, there are no birth defects associated with cannabis. So unlike a fetal alcohol syndrome, there's no fetal cannabis syndrome. So for example, if you consume cannabis, and a lot of women are actually consuming cannabis willfully during pregnancy because it treats nausea and vomiting. And a lot of women have, this disorder where they can't stop vomiting, and it's literally is like killing them and their baby. And there's several women that I've talked to that have consumed cannabis during their pregnancies, and their children are beautiful and healthy. And some of them, it's like they're talking about these experiences. It was like 20 years ago. Their kids are all grown up. I knew one woman who's actually, she has a brand of cannabis teas in Canada. She had triplets. She could not keep any food down during her entire pregnancy, had triplets, smoked through it, and her children are fabulous. So, there's a lot of anecdotal data showing that it's safe. There's a lot of doctors out there that would say, why would you ever choose cannabis for nausea and vomiting for pregnancy when there's these other drugs? And these women will tell you, I used these drugs. They didn't work. So, what were my options? Like, I'm going to, I'm not going to be stuck to an IV for like fluids and things like that through my entire pregnancy. And other people said it worked better. So that some of them said, okay, I've used these other pills. They have side effects. They're very expensive. Some of them even have a history of causing birth defects or issues in the past. Like there are some drugs that are marketed towards women for pregnancy for vomiting and nausea during pregnancy. And they were actually taken off the market in the past because it was suggested that they actually do cause birth defects and then put on the market later. So it's like there's questionable safety of some of the pharmaceuticals that women use. And there's even a ranking of how safe these drugs are or any drug is during pregnancy. People think that there's no research on CBD or THC during pregnancy. The fact is that any of these drugs that have gone through clinical trials, and CBD has actually gone through clinical trials as a drug called Epidiolex. And that was used to look at how people were taking it for epilepsy or seizures. There were some women that were taking Epidiolex during these clinical trials that became pregnant. And there's actually a hotline to say, report that you taking this drug and that you're on basically CBD, and to report how you're doing, how your baby's doing, anything. The government's tracking. So far, there's been no reports. There's different levels of pregnancy class risks associated with some drugs. There's some drugs that you take them, it will cause extreme birth defects, like horrible things. And these are like, class X, like no pregnant woman should ever go anywhere near it. No woman that's thinking about becoming pregnant should take these drugs. And there's other ones. There's like A, B, C, and D. A, of course, is the safest, like gold standard. Like they did a clinical study with all pregnant women and it passed with flying colors. The baby's even healthier after they took it or something, and there's very few of those because, of course, it's super risky. Like, what happens if you gave pregnant women this drug and all the babies didn't turn out okay? Like, that's like a huge ethical concern. So we don't really do studies like that anymore. What we do is we first test these drugs in rodents. So we give it to a pregnant, a rat, for example, and see what happens to their babies. And so if it happens that it looks like it's safe there, then they might move that drug into humans, or in some drugs that are already on the market, for example, right? These aren't new drugs, right? Like most of the drugs that are new, they have to be tested in this way, but there's other drugs that have been on the market forever. And we already know that women have taken these drugs. Some of them, again, causing low birth weight isn't a great outcome, right? Low birth weight in babies is associated with some negative harms. But a lot of things cause low birth weight. A lot of different prescription drugs can cause low birth weight. Smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, like there's so many different things that can cause low birth weight besides consuming cannabis, that it doesn't make it like the super red flag. Like people think like, oh my goodness, if I smoke cannabis, like my child's going to be dumb. Like it's not going to, they're going to be in the special class, like things like that. That's what the government used to say. Those things are not accurate. The Surgeon General coming on the TV, like I think a couple like months ago, and saying that the biggest crisis now is pregnant women consuming cannabis. That's a lot of propaganda. There has been a lot of studies on the effects of how cannabis impacts brain growth, both in early childhood and in, the fetal stages. And that was some of my work. I actually looked at how different drugs impact brain cell growth. So, I did some of this work. There's been so much work done by researchers all across the country on how different pharmaceutical drugs and illegal drugs, like again, they list cannabis as an illegal drug, but it's legal in many places. But how these drugs impact both the mother's health, the baby's health, and early childhood into adulthood. And I have to say, if a woman has a choice between using different substances, if you were going to drink during your pregnancy, don't drink. If you're going to use cannabis, for example, there's different ways. I always tell women to practice harm reduction, right? What's the lowest amount of THC you can use for either, if you need it for anxiety reduction, you need it for pain management, right? There's some women that become pregnant that were on morphine. Morphine is not good for pain, for brain development. I did some of that work. It's not good. So if you want to promote a healthy brain, sometimes, it's interesting that cannabis or CBD might actually be the best option for mothers who are sick, who become, for women who are sick, who become pregnant. So just be mindful. Don't smoke joints. It's actually the burning of cannabis, combustion of cannabis releases ammonia and other toxins. Don't use vape pens that might have additives in it that are not safe for you or your child. We barely know what some of these like harmful additives, like we heard the whole vaping scare with the vitamin E acetate being very unhealthy for the lungs and causing people to go into the hospital. Now imagine if you're a pregnant woman, you're vaping a vape pen that might have these toxins in it. We have no idea what that does to the fetus. Like, definitely, if you are pregnant, do not vape anything. Like, do not use a vape pen. Like, number one, like, please do not. Like, we just don't know. But if you are going to consume flower, there's some women that said, it wasn't edibles. There were certain ways. For some reason, there are some women that were like, for some reason, it was inhalation was the best method to stop, the very serious vomiting and nausea. And so for those women, I would say, if you do make the choice to do that, please, again, vaporize. And I said there's a difference between vape pen cartridges, the concentrates, and there's a difference between the vaporizer, like a portable vaporizer that has the cannabis in it that's just heating up the cannabis around it, releasing those terpenes and cannabinoids. That's the safest way to do inhalation. But for women, if you can't control your nausea or you can't control other symptoms of pain with CBD, try CBD. We do know that CBD, crosses the placenta. We do know that it crosses, if you're a breastfeeding mother, it does cross into breast milk. But, in terms of harm reduction, THC stimulates cannabinoid receptors much more strongly than CBD, and anandamide stimulating these cannabinoid receptors. So if you had to do harm reduction, you get away with pain management or whatever symptom manages with CBD, go with CBD over THC. But if you need THC, try the lowest dose. So always just be mindful that while cannabis isn't the worst thing that you could be consuming during pregnancy, is always best to limit the exposure if possible. But there were some women, out there that said, I feel so bad. I might have smoked that one joint before I knew I was pregnant. Like, what have I done? We get a lot of that now where we tell women, it's okay. There is no fetal marijuana syndrome. So, just be mindful and don't have guilt. Moms have enough guilt, by the way. Like, they have so much guilt over everything. They're like, what did I do? Like, my child be messed up for life. Child won't be. There's a lot of propaganda out there. But please also be mindful. Don't be dabbing, while you're breastfeeding or something. Like I've seen all sorts of things. So it's especially having this certification. It's like, I have clinicians tell me horror stories. I have women. Just be mindful and just remember too that, how you use cannabis. Like, this is a new industry, and the social norms and the stigma around cannabis using mothers is really high. So just try to use it in the most respectful way to keep you and your baby healthy, and also just, keep the image of being a safe and responsible mother.
Amazing. Is there any CBD in breast milk?
So CBD being present in breast milk is actually the biggest myth that I have to bust probably 10 times a day. So there's some kind of article out there that said CBD was in breast milk. And then, of course, this is how articles spread viral on the internet, is people plagiarize them and put them on 800 different websites. So somehow this article that says CBD in breast milk is everywhere. There's also a lot of people that think anandamide, which is the bliss molecule, the number one endocannabinoid in our endocannabinoid system, is highly present in breast milk. So people say, we have all this anandamide in our breast milk. That's why the baby is, sucking, and trying to get the breast milk out. It's actually activating its feeding centers. The thing is that there's no CBD. The human body does not produce CBD, not in the brain, not in breast milk, nowhere. So CBD only comes from the cannabis plant. So that's a myth.
That's good
the
to
other
know.
thing,
Okay.
yes, 100%. But also, there's several different cannabinoids the body makes, and so these endocannabinoids. So there's anandamide, there's 2-AG, there's P, there's little minor cannabinoids. So the highest number of cannabinoids that's in breast milk is actually a cannabinoid called 2-AG. That's a really, really long word I won't say in this podcast, but it's 2-AG. And so if you want to know what is in breast milk, is 2-AG. And it's actually, because it's an cannabinoid, is stimulating the feeding response and everything like that. We never talk about this. We always talk about anandamide, but 2-AG is also a cannabinoid that's produced everywhere in our body. And and, is released in a different way than an anandamide, but it's just as active in our brain and body. So it's important. A lot of people will be like, the CBD is in there and the anandamide. I'm like, actually, guys, it's 2-AG. But people don't hear about the other parts of our endocannabinoid system. It's just like how we always hear like THC or CBD, and we don't hear too much about the other cannabinoids that are made in the plant, like the less sexy ones. You're like, hey, there's a CBN and there's a CBC and a CBG. Well, in the same way, 2-AG is there in our body, and it's there in breast milk. It's actually very, very concentrated in breast milk. So that's an important thing to note. So, when you are looking at articles on the internet, look for the source. Is it a reputable website, or is it like something that was shared on Facebook, and then you go to the website and you're like, who wrote this? Like, there's a lot of that. Like, I literally have mothers, I even had nurses been like, I read it somewhere, it's true. And I said, just because you saw it on the internet doesn't make it true. And that's why I created my certification, because I went through every single published research paper. I talked to the clinicians that did the research. I talked to mothers. I talked to doctors across the country. And I did some of this work myself, consulting patients. There's real data out there, and there's a lot of baloney. You get what you want. You get what you pay for on the internet. Yes, your education is free, but who are your teachers? It might be somebody, working for $2 an hour writing SEO, blogs. That doesn't really know anything about cannabis.
That's very true. So speaking of education, you have a couple of educational resources that are available for patients and mothers. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I created the Cannabis and Motherhood certification because of that need out there to educate clinicians. I really found out that if your doctor knew about all the risks and benefits of using cannabis during pregnancy, breastfeeding, labor, parenting, for postpartum depression, there's actually a very strong benefit for it, that they would be able to come to a much more educated decision on whether or not they felt comfortable discussing it with their patients. There was actually some research out there that suggested clinicians weren't talking about it with patients just because they didn't know any information and they felt embarrassed. So they just left it off the table, even though they thought personally it might be okay. They just weren't informed enough. So I created this course, which is actually a 10-module program, and it goes through everything from, the basics of the endocannabinoid system in mother and child to the science of it. What are the cannabinoids? What are endocannabinoids? What are terpenes? What does all this language mean? And I use a very visual way too, because, we just need to understand, what's in the placenta, what's in the breast milk, what's in, what are in these different body parts as the pregnancy is changing, because there's different levels of cannabinoids in the body, the mother's body and the baby's body. Like we do not stay the same as women. We're cycling. We have our menstrual cycles. Well, we have all these different cycles with hormones and with endocannabinoids. So there's so much for everyone to learn. And then what the benefits are of using cannabis versus some of these other drugs that we talked about, from drugs that treat nausea and vomiting to opioids to epileptic drugs. Like, what is the risk of using cannabis versus these other drugs? Where can some of this research go in the future? Could we make drugs that help with pain management during labor, cannabinoid based, instead of using some of the drugs that we use now? There's a lot of things that we cover is more targeted towards doctors, nurses, doulas, midwives, and other wellness professionals. But we do actually have patients that are also going through it too. We have quizzes and certifications in there. So, if you actually go through the course completely, you can take the exam at the end and pass it and get a certification too. And then you'll be qualified to make some of these consultations with women who are looking to have these discussions. So I think it's really important we train the next generation, because guess what? There are more and more people using cannabis, and not knowing is not good enough anymore. You need to know whether or not it's safe for your patient and how to have that conversation.
Amazing. And we'll include the addresses for your course as well as your book in the notes. Is there any last minute comments that you might have for anyone that might be listening right now?
If you have any questions, I have a little widget on my website, drmicheleross.com. Sometimes, these answers can be provided really quickly. Sometimes they're a much longer discussion in a consultation. But if there's something off your top of your head that you're just not clear about, shoot us an email. We're happy to help.
Fantastic. This was an amazing conversation. Of course, we just scratched the surface, and I feel like there's a lot more to be talked about and a lot more to explore. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to maybe talking and continuing this conversation in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.